Well, hi everybody. This is Truth Seeker here. And last week we took a look at the first chapter of Genesis and the third and fourth creative days in particular. We went into quite a detailed discussion about those creative days. And I thought, it might make sense to continue on taking a look at the book of Genesis. There are a lot of stories. There's a lot of material there that we can look at that help us with an understanding of whether or not the Bible is a credible source of information. Is it presenting the truth? Are we concerned with truth? And I think as human beings, we have a curiosity. It's an innate curiosity, something that we're born with, to make us want to understand how things work and what the truth of the matter is. What is the truth of our universe? What is the truth about ourselves? This is what makes us distinctive as creatures. And so I think Genesis and a closer look at Genesis is warranted if we are interested in understanding the truth of everything around us. And so what we'll do is we'll just continue on from where we pick up basically from where we left off last week. And last week we kind of left off at the fifth creative day, fifth and sixth creative day. And I think there's some pretty interesting aspects of the sixth creative day and the description there of the creation of human beings, us, that are pretty interesting to take a look at, and pretty damning when it comes to the credibility of the Bible. And these are matters that are self contradictions. And so let's take a look at what Genesis has to say about creation of humans. And we'll take a look at the end. There are actually two accounts of humankind's creation, and that's in the first chapter of Genesis, and a second independent account in the second chapter. Both Bible scholars, say that they are both separate accounts of how God made humankind, male and female. And they were interwoven or put together, documented in the Bible, but they aren't the same account. And there are differences, and the differences are of interest to us. So let's pick up from where we left off last week, and we'll pick up with the 26th verse of Genesis, where it talks about humans. And it says here, and God, I think that word there is Elohim, God said, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea and the fowl of the air, and over the cattle, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creepeth upon the earth." So God created man in his own image. In the image of God created he him, male and female created he them. So let's take a look at that a little bit more closely. First off, God is speaking here to someone else. Let us make man in our image. So apparently there is someone else in the mix here. We don't know who that is. Is it the angels? Is it the Logos? We don't know. It doesn't say who this is. It's just something in the plural. We know that there were more than just a single individual in the process of creating human beings. And the plan here was to make humans in the image of God and their likeness, after our likeness, it states. And when you look up these words, it means what they say there. There's nothing of any particular interest in the word there, except that it means what we would presume it would mean, that we were made after the character of God, and not necessarily in the physical image of God, although it could be implied that God had a physical form and that he made humankind after himself in a physical sense. But more of it is after God characteristically in his ability to think, reason, communicate, and all of the characteristics that are attributable to human beings were alleged in this statement to have been modeled after those characteristics of God. And so this is a pretty plain statement of what that intent was, that God intended humans to be a replication of himself. A little scratchy throat going on. Sorry. And here we already have a problem. If we have a spoiler alert, know what's coming up in the second chapter of Genesis, when we talk about this, the parallel account of human creation. But first, let's take a look at the rest of this scripture, talking about man being created after the character and image of God. It says, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea. So that was an aspect of human character, to have dominion over the fish of the sea. Now, to have dominion means you have to be able to judge. You have to make choices. You have to be a decision maker. You have to be able to have forethought. You have to have the characteristic of leadership and looking after the interest of those that you have this dominion over. Now, there are different ways of ruling, certainly. There are autocracies and there are democracies and such. Of course, we can't expect that a democracy would exist over animals. But certainly, when you look at the complex ecosystems, and certainly at this time when this was written, the complexity of the earth from an ecological point of view could not be appreciated. It is certainly not appreciated at all. Dominion over the fish of the sea meant one thing in this context, which was really to have rights, the right to exploit. And that has been the interpretation of the scripture all along. And that has really been a problematic aspect of the Bible because it gives people who believe in the Bible this idea that the earth is ours, that it was given to us to exploit the resources of, and we've done a very poor job of it as the population has exploded. The human population has exploded. It's become very critical that we manage the resources of this planet carefully. We can do irreparable damage to this planet, and this planet is a finely tuned organism, really, when you stop and you think about it. This Earth has countless ecological systems, and if you throw something out of balance, it could cause harm that actually impacts us. I mean, for example, we're exploiting carbon resources for fuels, petroleum and coal, and this exploitation has led to a climate impact. As we emit more and more CO2 into the atmosphere, we're creating a greenhouse effect. And so this idea that we have the right to do with the earth as we please is a dangerous thought, a dangerous idea. Even if people have the idea of stewardship, that we should be good stewards, that still gives us the idea that we have some kind of authoritative right over this planet. And that is a very, very problematic idea, concept to have in people's minds. We need to think of ourselves as a part of this planet, that we are a natural product of this planet, that we belong and have a niche in this planet, and to live within the bounds of that niche, so that we don't disrupt or at least minimize the impact that our presence on the earth as a species isn't such that it causes other species to become extinct. And that's really a very real situation. I'll give you an example. One of the greatest ecological disasters is the Aral Sea. I don't know how many people here are aware of the Aral Sea, but in 1960, the Aral Sea, which is in I think they call that the Caucasian or Caucasus. I'm geography. It's in the Middle East somewhere, in that Afghanistan region. I can, in fact, actually, I should look it up a little bit more. Aral Sea, and it is around Kazakhstan. Yes, I was correct about that. Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, in that region, they call well, it's the area of Afghanistan, Iran. It's in that Middle Eastern area, in the it's essentially a desert area, and the Aral Sea didn't have an outlet. It was the fourth largest body of water in the world, and under the rule of or authority of the Soviet Union, and somebody in the Soviet Union thought it would be a good idea to plant cotton in the region. And they diverted water from the two rivers that fed into the Aral Sea. Now, in 1960, the Aral Sea had a thriving fishing industry, and it supported a lot of people. It was a bustling ecology, and it was a beautiful freshwater body. And again, as I said, it was the fourth largest freshwater body in area in the world. And when the Soviet Union diverted water to irrigate cotton fields, they didn't realize that they had cut off the supply that replenishes the water that evaporates out from the Aral Sea. The Aral Sea was in a fine balance. There was as much water evaporating out of the sea as was being fed into the sea from the two rivers that drained into emptied into the Aral Sea. When they cut off that supply of water, the evaporation continued at the same rate, and the sea began to shrink. By the 1990s, it had reduced its size by 75%. Now I think it's less than 10% of the area that it once had. The rest of it is desert. It's bizarre because you'll see these large fishing vessels out in the middle of what looks like the Sahara Desert, surrounded by a sea of sand, and the what's left of the Aral Sea is too salty to support the fish that once lived there. And so an entire ecosystem was completely and utterly destroyed by this diversion of water just for irrigation. And what they failed to have any foresight about, the Soviet planners, was that within a few years, the cotton fields themselves became too salty from leaching the diverted irrigation water into these cotton fields, leached the salts into the ground, and they began to accumulate, and the ground became too salty, too toxic to support any cotton. So now they can't grow the cotton, and the Aral Sea is dead. And what's left of it is less than 10% of what had been there 50, 60 years ago. This is one of the greatest ecological disasters that ever occurred. And it could have been completely avoided if people had realized the delicate balance of that ecosystem. So this idea that we have this right or been granted this dominion to exploit the resources of this planet is a dangerous concept, a dangerous idea, not only for ourselves but for the ecological systems that fill certain areas of our planet. So the Bible is the source of this idea, and that is one of the objections that I have to the Bible, because we are not and never have been or will be. If we're going to continue on this planet, we can't think that way. We have to get in line with the idea that we, not even stewards, that we are just one of many millions of species that have just as much right to this planet as we do. And so I think that's an aspect of the Bible there that really creates a dangerous mindset. Let's put it that way. It poses a dangerous mindset. And you hear this all the time from I don't want to make this a political statement, but this idea of the environment has become a major political issue. The global warming has become a major political issue, and people believe that we have the right to exploit the resources of this planet. And a lot of individuals believe that, well, the Earth is just this temporary thing that God put humans here to make angels, okay? And that's not right. That God will destroy this in Armageddon, and by that point, the earth will have served its purpose, and you either go to heaven or you go to hell, and you're there for however long. If you're a Jehovah's Witness or a Bible student, you believe that the earth is going to last forever, and that you're going to live on this earth in perfect bliss for eternity, all eternity, if you do what God wants you to do. And that brings us to another point in this context of Genesis. It says that God said, "Let him have dominion," and God created him male and female after his own image. Now, this is an aspect that I have some troubles with, and this is something that I struggled with even as a believing Bible student. The idea that we were created in the image of God. How could we be? Now, if we look at the second chapter of Genesis and the parallel companion account where describes the formation of the Garden of Eden and of humans, Adam and Eve, it says in the 7th verse that the Lord God formed man of the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living soul. And the Lord God planted a garden eastward in Eden, and there he put the man whom he formed. And out of the ground made the Lord to grow every tree that is pleasant in sight and good for food. The tree of life was also in the midst of the garden, and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Now, this is where I've always had this conundrum. We call this this kind of inconsistency, dissonance, cognitive dissonance. How could man have been made in the image of God if humans were not created with an inherent sense of good and evil, or a basic moral sense? And that conflicts with the idea of having dominion over the fish of the sea and the fowl of the air. Because without a moral sense, humankind can't have judgment. You can't judge without a moral sense. You can make certain fundamental decisions, but you can't make the kind of judgments that you need to make as a ruler. So right here, the Bible is inconsistent with itself because of the very qualities of character that you have to have in order to meet that criteria of being a king over the earth is missing. And so the Bible is inconsistent with itself because humans could not have been made in the likeness of God and a reflection of God and a moral copy of God if man had no sense of morals. So right there we have a problem. And I think to a large extent it's because the individuals that wrote the Bible didn't have a real in-depth understanding of human psychology. Many of the things that we understand today are very recent sciences. And even the understanding of the human mind is ongoing. We don't even know what self-awareness really is. I mean, this is something that is at the forefront of understanding. People are looking at, scientists are looking at what this thing is we call self-awareness, and it's a complex interaction of the neural network that exists within our brains. And our brains, this is where what we are is from a moral and characteristic point of view, and it makes us who we are. This brain. And they didn't have this understanding. They didn't even know what the brain's function was, and much less the psychology of humankind. And so here we have a real problem with the Bible, in that how can man be considered to have been made in the image of God if he was missing such a fundamental characteristic as good and evil, and the moral sense. And the thing is, the problem is here, this is an innate sense. Okay, so it's maybe more complex with human beings, because we have a much more complex psychology. We have a brain that works in a very complicated way. We don't even fully understand the whole workings of the mind, but we do know that we stand out from every other creature on the planet, and that we have this ability to put together patterns and understanding. Just thinking of the mathematics, I mean, the best that certain animals can do, like a parrot, for example, is recognize certain geometric figures, do some simple calculations, but they don't have the ability to logically work out the mathematical hypotheses and axioms and theorems that we've been able to. I had a friend this morning who sent me, he was listening to a TED Talk, and he asked me a little about a particular equation that they were talking about, formula, an identity, and it was Euler's identity. And that involves what we call imaginary numbers. Now, how can animals don't just have that kind of sense, that ability to think at that abstract level? We humans operate on a highly complex plane in that sense. Our brains have evolved into something that is rather unique, and we don't believe existed prior to our development as a species. There may be animals that had a relatively high intellect, and dolphins certainly, and elephants, and even a sense of self-awareness. And dolphins have, they name other dolphins. They go by names. They have their own way of communicating with one another, but not to the level of sophistication that we have. We're kind of unique in that sense. And for us to be missing something like a moral sense when we were created just doesn't ring true. And it's not true in a very fundamental way, because what we call morals, the basic morals that we have are not to kill. Now, I mean, it's not a profound thing for the Ten Commandments to say, "Thou shalt not kill." That's something that is something that's innate within us. We don't need really that kind of instruction. It's something that really is a property that we possess. This is something that exists in the animal kingdom, in the animal world. If you look at animals in their natural environment, they often, especially creatures that live in a social context, herd animals and animals that like elephants that group together in little tribes, and chimpanzees. They even canines with their social network, and lions, a very social creature. They don't kill one another. I mean, yes, there is a certain degree to which that may happen, but it's not. It is. They have this innate sense that we don't kill our kind. And there's a sense of preservation for the species, and to maintain that preservation. I was watching a documentary on a group of chimpanzees that were being studied. And chimpanzees do have a very tribal existence. They live in different groups, and they have hierarchical structures with a male that achieves the I guess alpha status of the group. And in this particular tribe of chimpanzees that they were documenting, there was a small chimpanzee, Oscar, that whose mother died, and this chimpanzee was helpless. It was tiny, small, motherless. And the mother in that social arrangement is a chimpanzee's sole protection. And without the mother, it was sure to die. And it turned out in the end that the alpha male took on the role of protecting this baby chimpanzee. There was an empathy, there was a compassion that existed within this brawn of an ape to take on this little helpless creature. There was something in its heart that naturally made him want to take on this little creature and protect it and nourish it and train him to be able to survive on his own. This is something that is inherent within us. This is morality. You could call it what you want with animals, but maybe it is a more rudimentary level for them. Like I said, humans unquestionably are much more complex. The area of a brain on a whale for empathy is much larger in proportion to the whale's brain than that same segment is in the human brain, causing many to think that whales, and this is why they live in a social arrangement, pods, are probably the most empathetic creatures on the planet. Again, this is some speculation, but it doesn't go without some evidence behind it in the fact that they know that from a dimensional point of view that this has this part of the brain that exercises or expresses empathy within a creature, within us and within whales is larger in its proportionate size in whales, and that they need an interaction with one another to a greater degree, and the effect of not being supported from an emotional point of view, physical, emotional point of view, has a far stronger implications for a whale than it does even for us because of that. How could humans be without this property? It doesn't make us human. In fact, that's one of the greatest aspects of our humanity, is our ability to have compassion for one another and to empathize and to sympathize. And so to think that man or humans were devoid of this is really unthinkable. It doesn't make sense. And then here it says God said, let us make man in our image, and deprived him of this quality. It doesn't make sense. Cognitive dissonance all over the place. And it's because how can a Bronze Age man who was 4,000 years separate from Freud to be able to understand these things? And so, that's why we have these discrepancies. So then, what are the implications of that? If God is the author of the Bible, we would expect that it would reflect what we know is a fundamental truth, especially about us, the crowning achievement of God's handiwork, to identify this as being a property within humans from the outset. But it says we were missing this quality. So how could we be in the image of God if this is a characteristic that God possesses? And like I tried to emphasize how important that characteristic is. So then the account goes on and says, you can eat of every tree in the garden except this tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And what does that mean? I mean, what kind of if a person is devoid of this ability to comprehend a moral sense, all you've done is piqued his curiosity. If we have a curiosity, I mean, after all, we were created in the image of God, there would be a curiosity. You can eat of everything except this one tree. I mean, come on. Human nature is such that instantly that would pique our curiosity. We'd want to know what's behind this. What's the secret here? And the account in the second chapter of Genesis, or is it the third chapter? I forget which, where it talks about the snake, the talking snake. And again, this has something to do, well, you can either understand this from a metaphorical point of view or a realistic point of view. You can't have your cake and eat it too. But the Bible students say whatever happened here had real implications, because humans have been born in sin and have been suffering from the effects of sin for 6,000 years, they've inherited this trait that was of sin, having lost perfection in the garden. And so they believe that's real, and that humans suffer because they disobeyed. But then you can't say, well, you got a discrepancy, so we'll look at this thing from a metaphorical point of view. So you have to believe in the talking snake. Oh, well, that was a miracle. And you have to believe in miracles. And there's no evidence of miracles. Miracles are not real. So God forbade humans to partake of this tree, and they called it of knowledge of good and evil. And what is that? How are they supposed to comprehend this if they don't have this sense to begin with? So right there's a paradox and a conundrum that really is not resolvable. It's something that we can't grasp because it doesn't make sense. It's like it's self conflicting kind of situation. But nonetheless, God gave humans this order. And Paul in 2 Timothy, I think it is, 1 Timothy, 2nd chapter, he talks about women, and he makes disparaging remarks that women aren't qualified to teach in the church because Eve was deceived and Adam wasn't. So men have some property or character that women don't possess, and don't qualify them as teachers in the church because look what happened to Eve. That's a very misogynist point of view. But it also conflicts with what the Bible states, because he says Adam was not deceived. Well, then what do you have? Does Adam understand what good and evil meant? Did he understand? Or did he not possess this? Innocence lost. You can't have it both ways. Now, obviously, Paul wasn't thinking very well when he wrote Timothy. Well, actually, it wasn't even Paul who wrote Timothy. There's quite a bit of agreement, apparently, among scholars that Timothy was not written by Paul. But that's neither here nor there. The fact is that they put it in the canon, and they've got it so that it conflicts. It makes a conflicting statement with what Genesis has to say. So you have this situation, humankind that was allegedly made in the image of man, or image of God, not possessing a very crucial characteristic of God, a moral sense, a moral standard, to be able to distinguish between right and wrong, good and bad. And that's what's meant there. And this has to be taken at its word if you're going to believe the Bible. And then you have the serpent, who's the most subtle of all creatures, and he comes and he has a little chat with Eve, and he said to the woman, points out that God said you can't, you shall not eat of every tree of the garden. And the woman said, we could eat of the fruit of the trees, of all the fruit of the trees of the garden, but the fruit of the tree which is in the midst of the garden, God said, You shall not eat of it, neither shall ye touch it, lest ye die. And that was the woman. And the woman apparently understood this well enough to say, well, I can't, I should leave alone. And so both Adam and Eve had this knowledge, apparently, that they were told not to eat it. And then you have the serpent saying, well, actually, God is hiding something from you, and doesn't want you to know this little secret we have. And the serpent said unto the woman, you shall not surely die, which was the punishment for eating of the fruit. That's an important aspect. I mean, what parent who has the privilege of being able to hold the innocent little baby that they've parented and not try to teach that child with as much love and affection as possible, and to protect it while teaching certain things. For example, you don't intentionally burn your child on a stove. That's abuse. That's child abuse. To teach it the lesson that the stove is hot and to keep away from it. We don't have to learn everything by experience. And parents, we know that. And parents who love their children do what they can to teach their children in such a way that minimizes the pain that the child might have to endure. And so it's just a natural thing. If you love your child, you don't go right to the worst, harshest punishment when on the especially on the act of a first of disobedience. but God said, if you eat of this thing, I'm going to kill you. What kind of love is there? I mean, I expressed this to my cousin last week when we've had this debate ongoing, and it suddenly stopped. Apparently, he's not interested in engaging me anymore with our discussion on Genesis, but I think he had given me some obscure. I don't want to get too detailed into the background of this, except that he brought up Elisha in 2 Kings. There's some prophecy there, and this is the same Elisha, and I pointed this out to him, that there was an account where Elisha was walking into a village, and as he was entering the village, he was encountered by children who started making fun of him, calling him Baldy, ye Baldy. And Elisha didn't like it, and he turned around and cursed these children, and this curse brought about 2 she-bears out of the woods. The implication is God brought them out, and slaughtered 42 children. Now think of the. I said that is not the type of God that I could worship. I mean, to think of the terror, the pain, and the awful horror of that children would have to experience because this prophet of God had a thin skin. They didn't show him enough respect. Boom. Let's give them a horrific death. Oh, well, you see, as Bible students, we say, oh, well, they'll be resurrected and they'll have everything will be right in the kingdom. God will bring the kingdom about and everything will be made right. Yeah. You think that memory is going to be erased? And if that memory isn't erased, then what was the purpose of the thing to begin with? So the trauma that these children, the terror, the fear that these children had to undergo when all they were doing was being kids is a terrible, terrible thing. This is not a moral God. It's a monster. That's what we're talking about. And I told my cousin, I can't worship that kind of God. A God that would take an innocent pair and punish them with the harshest punishment possible because of a minor act of disobedience is not a very loving God. He's not a God that's loving them like a parent would love their children, like their child. I look at my grandson every day, and I love that little boy with all my heart. And I just look at that innocence. And yes, he can be a devil at times. Yes, he can be bad. But I love him so much. And I know he has so much to learn. And we try to give him as positive an environment as possible because of that love that we have. We don't sentence him to death. We don't torture him. We don't threaten him with bears to come out of the woods and tear him from limb to limb. No. There's no love in that. And that has to ring true. In any book in the Bible, if the Bible is the Word of God and the truth, then it must reflect love, and it doesn't. But I'm running on a bit of ahead of myself here in the tangent. So here they were given this mandate not to eat of the fruit or they would die. And the serpent said, look, if you eat of the fruit, God knows that you're going to be just like him with the knowledge of good and evil. And your eyes will be open and you will be as the gods, knowing good and evil. And why wouldn't that seem like a good thing? I mean, after all, this allegedly, according to the Bible, the covering cherub was Lucifer. It was given as a mentor or guide to the inexperienced first pair, and they were to trust him. And so why wouldn't they trust him? See, nothing seems real about the story. And there's not even a good moral lesson to be drawn from it if it's metaphorical, to be understood in a symbolic way. But she agreed. She picked the fruit, and Adam partook of the fruit, and she did, and God executed the judgment. And Adam and Eve grew old and died. Now, the idea of justice here is wrong. That we, in our criminal system, we believe that the punishment should be commensurate with the crime. That there is we're looking for justice. Not that justice can be attained in every circumstance. Certainly, when a life is taken, justice can't be met. But even if you took the other person, let's say the person who took someone's life, if you a life for a life, that really isn't justice, because you can't bring that life back that way. And certainly the person who committed the murder is likely not to have valued human life very much to begin with. So it's no great loss if he loses his own life because of his act, because he didn't value it much to begin with. Of course, there are crimes of passion flaring out, but we're not talking about that. We're talking about premeditated. And so, is it just that God went right to the death sentence for this disobedience if he had love? Well, the Bible student's answer, and Charles Taze Russell's answer for this was, well, yes, God was love, because he thought in his infinite wisdom that humankind would benefit from this experience with sin and evil. And by condemning Adam and Eve to death, would also condemn would cause them to be imperfect, and then their progeny would be imperfect, and then they would, using Bible terminology, they would experience the permission of evil and the exceeding sinfulness of sin. That's a Bible student slogan, and and that this is a good thing, that this would be, this 6,000-year lesson of sin would be a perpetual touchstone of the consequences of evil, no matter how small the sin might be. It ultimately leads to death, and that the soul that sinneth, it shall die. And this will be an everlasting lesson forever and ever and ever, and that everybody will benefit from this in the end, far better. And this is the idea that the Bible students have, that Jesus has paid a substitutionary price for Adam and his transgression, and by having paid this price, a perfect man's life for a perfect man's life, he purchased Adam and his seed, and Eve's included in this. Eve was part of the deal, and that he would redeem them and teach them righteousness in the 1,000-year kingdom, and give them the opportunity to make the choice themselves, having physically experiencing evil and having the counterpart of good. And this would be a lesson that would maximize those that would choose good. Well, I mean, that if you have to go that far to optimize the number of people who will choose good, then you obviously have flawed a design flaw in the beginning, or your character is flawed from the beginning, especially if they were made after your image. So, speaking of God there, but the problem with that is many Bible students, and I'm not saying that all do, I'm not sure what Russell thought, but the cosmos is a pretty huge place. And since the days of Russell, he died in 1916, our understanding of the universe has grown exponentially. And we see that the universe is likely infinite in its extent, which means there probably are other life forms on other planets like us, intelligent and so on. These are prospects that he couldn't conceive of back in 1916 or in the earlier years of his ministry. And so he couldn't address these types of questions. But the thing is, if God was believe that experience was the best way to teach a lesson, then if this universe is to be filled with thinking beings, unless Jesus and this lesson is duplicated over and over and over again an infinite number of times, then what was the purpose of having it done the first time? Because you're going to have, if this is the one and only time in which sin is permitted, then you've got the same situation that the majority of humanity, subsequent humanity, would have to live and learn of evil anecdotally from the people talking and teaching. And so why not do it from the outset? I mean, it just doesn't make sense. And unless you duplicate this situation here over and over again, which according to Bible student doctrine isn't what's going to happen. So you've got this problem with Bible student doctrine. And then you could say, well, God has no intention of making the rest of the universe populated. Then what in God's name do we need 50 billion? We know of at least something like the 50 billion galaxies, and each galaxy having 100 billion stars, and around each star there are systems of planets, 3 or 4 or 5 planets around each. So how many? You're multiplying the number of planets. What are they for? God's amusement? He doesn't. What would God need with a place like the moon duplicated billions of times, or planets, lifeless planets like Earth with water and land and nothing else alive? I mean, it just doesn't make sense to think that. So you have this problem with the idea of a loving God. And why did he tempt them, basically tempt them to take this fruit that would complete them from a point of view in their character, to make them like him, and then punish them with the harshest punishment, and make them go through some truly awful experiences. Many people died horrific deaths, and for what purpose? would a loving God allow that to happen? I just have so much trouble with this. And then if they didn't have this innate sense of moral understanding, good and evil, then God judged them unjustly because one of the basic criteria for standing trial in court is whether or not you have the ability to conceive good and bad, right and wrong. And if you don't have that ability, then you can't stand trial. They find some other facilitation for you, a mental institute or whatever. So here we have a number of issues with Genesis and the second chapter, and how God is portrayed here, and the whole idea of the fall, and it really is a major cognitive dissonance if you really try to look at it. There's no way to reconcile any of these matters whatsoever. So these are some of the issues that I have with the second and third chapters of Genesis. Really, the largest issues that I have with them. And can we say that God is love? One of the things that one of the questions that comes up often, I hear discussed, is what is atheism? And can you really truly be an atheist if the possibility, if you can't prove the existence of God or non-existence of God, then atheism must be qualified. And you can't say that, reasonably, that there is no God. But I think you can think of atheism in the same sense that, like if you look at the Bible and believe that it's not the Word of God, and I think there's very, very strong evidence that suggests or indicates that this book is the product of human minds, the conjurings of humanity, and has nothing to do with a higher power or higher being. Either it is, then it must be all true and can't be polluted, because if God allowed his word to be polluted or contaminated with error, then how can you believe it? How can he expect you to believe something that's been altered? But then again, when you look at the Bible, how can you accept it when there are so many discordant aspects of the Bible that can't be reconciled? And so with this question of atheism, it's, yes, there is no way that you can prove that some deity doesn't exist or does exist. There's no evidence for it. There's no evidence against it. There's no evidence for it. Therefore, you can't conclude there is no great deity that is behind the universe. But what you can say is, I don't believe the Bible and the God that's portrayed in that Bible. Because if the Bible can't be believed, how can the God that's supposedly, allegedly being taught by that book be credible? His existence be real? I believe there's good cause to say with almost absolute certainty that you can be an atheist to the God of the Bible. Maybe not to the concept of, let's say, the broader, separate concept outside of the Bible of some higher deity. Different dimensions. We don't know. We have no way of knowing. We can only talk about those things that we observe. And that's kind of like one of the problems with some of the cosmological theories that have arisen, is that there's no way to derive evidence to show whether the postulate is right or wrong. So, but with the Bible, that's not the question that we're talking about here. And when we talk about God, the Bible talks about a very specific God. So you can be an atheist to the God of the Bible. Can't necessarily say that for the separate question about a greater God that could possibly exist. We can't. But then again, on the other hand, we can't. It's a moot point, really, because we can't talk about it. We have nothing to allow us to have a conversation in that regard, because there's nothing that we can say yay or nay about that kind of God. So we have to keep an open mind on that question. But when we talk about atheism, we're talking about something very specific here. When we talk about the Bible, we're talking about something very specific. And that specificity is the God of the Bible. And I can say with certainty that I am an atheist to that God. I find it much harder to believe in this God. You would really have to delude yourself. I think this is one of the reasons why my cousin cut off my conversation with him, is because he knows that he can't answer the questions that I'm asking him, because he has no answers for it. They just there's nothing that you can point to that would substantiate his faith and belief in the Bible. So with that, I hope I did this subject justice. Justice. Since we're talking about morals and talking about justice. And I'd like to continue on the topic of Genesis in the next couple of videos, because I think Genesis is such a foundational, why they call it Genesis. It's so foundational to the doctrinal systems of the Bible students and to the Jehovah's Witnesses that everything hinges upon it. The whole idea of salvation hinges upon what occurs in this book, what is presented in this book. And the identity of an entire nation is keyed into this book. So I think continuing on in our analysis and our review of this book it's going to reveal some interesting questions. Most of them are things that, as children we were taught, like Noah's flood, and many of the technical issues that are associated with that. And I think that could be fun. Just the structural thing. I mean, you can't make a wooden boat that big and have it held together. You know the trouble that they had with the sailing vessels that they made in the 19th century, and why they didn't last that long? Because they bowed under their own weight, and they lose their sailing dynamics, and when that's critical to a vessel. And wood, for any, there was the lack of capability of building anything else other than wooden ships up until the 19th and 20th centuries. But that was the only building material they had, and then there was a limiting size that they couldn't go beyond, practical. And so we'll take a look at some of these things. I think will be fun. And I wish you all the best. This is Truth Seeker here, wishing everybody so long. Until the next time we chat.